the opportunity a number of years ago to go with my then boss at the Department of Justice down to the camp where my folks are at down in Topaz. And because we were in Salt Lake City because my boss was giving a speech on a day of remembrance a number of years ago. And we went down to Topaz. And I don't know how many of you have actually been back to the campsites where your families were during the war. But I would encourage you to do so. We left Salt Lake City before the crack of dawn. We drove and we drove and we drove. And I, for the life of me, have never been in a place more in the middle of nowhere than it was in Topaz. It was way out there. It seemed way out there. And, you know, there isn't much left in Topaz. There are foundations that are still there. There's a plaque that somebody erected. There are pieces of rubble still around on the ground. And there are remnants of the barracks and of the construction because people salvaged it after the war. So, you know, you drive around the local town of Delta, remember Delta, right? And you see parts of the barracks still up as garages and additions to houses. And it's somewhat eerie seeing this. But it was a matter of fact. It was a part of the local population. It was part of life. I remember in my father's high school yearbooks, you know, seeing pictures of them playing the local team, the local hockey team in Delta, and that was, you know, that was a neighboring team. That's where you went to go off and play a game of basketball and have a little competition in the middle of nowhere. But here we are in Delta, which was the closest town to the site of Topaz, and there was a county museum. And the county museum folks said, well, come on by and see our exhibit on Topaz. You know, we think you really enjoy it. And my boss and I went there, and you know, I thought there'd be one diorama, sort of laying out what happened to their neighbors. But instead, what we found was that most of this county museum was set aside to tell the story of the Topaz camp. And the people of Delta, and my guess is there are no longer and have not been for a long time Japanese Americans living in Delta, Utah. But the people of Delta, Eugene folks, you know, made it their priority to preserve the story because it was part of their history too. And to try to tell the story of what happened during this difficult time during World War II as part of their legacy. And they have, over the years, worked with Japanese Americans around the country to try to preserve that legacy, to try to buy up the camp land so it would be preserved here in the middle of nowhere as a remembrance of what the camp was. And they do that work to this day. But I wonder what it's going to be like going forward. You know, it's interesting watching the Japanese American community vis-a-vis the Asian American community writ large. At one point in time, Japanese American community was one of the larger Asian American communities in the United States. Immigration has slowed or stopped, really. You wonder what the future holds for Japanese Americans. And I've had these conversations with leaders in the JACL and other Japanese American organizations of what's next? What are we going to do? Is there a future? Is there a future for my kids who had a mother that was born in Poland, right, but who have a Japanese last name? Are they going, you know, what's going to happen to my sister's kids, daughter, whose last name is Newman, And I'm sure the same situation holds true for many folks in this room. What happens after generation, especially as we integrate into the mainstream? We integrate into everyday American life. What's the future? What's the Japanese American legacy? And how do you get there? And I would argue that it's so important to keep this going. And it may not be the same sort of story that we've seen historically, just because things have changed, situations have changed. For Japanese Americans, this is, you want to make sure our story is told. You want to make sure that the internment story gets fair play. You want to make sure that students learn about this as a fundamental part of our history. And we've made progress in telling that story, I think due in large part to the good work of the JACL and other groups over the years of telling this story, of fighting for redress. And, for me, having come into this and coming out of school at a time when there was the study commission in the early 80s, and I had the privilege of working for the Commission on Wartime Relocation during that first summer when we did hearings around the country, and people really for the first time, and certainly for the first time in an official government setting, got to tell their stories in hearings around the country. I frankly did not know what to expect during that summer. I thought, and knowing my parents' Nisei friends, I thought these will be pretty quick hearings and not much of a story will come out and it will be very matter of fact. And this happened, and suck it up and move on. But I remember being stunned at hearing the stories that started to come out in that summer of 1981, of hearing people's stories, of hearing from people who were parents of friends of mine, were people who told these extremely eloquent stories of what happened to them and their families, and what it meant so many years later, and the stigma that was still there of the internment, what it meant not to be trusted by your government. And for me, certainly having had the opportunity a number of years later to work in that same building at the Department of Justice and having an office literally around the corner from where the Attorney General of the United States had her office. And to think that we could come in a generation to a situation where Japanese Americans, people of Japanese ancestry, citizen and non-citizen alike, could go from the suspect class to go into the American mainstream, which frankly, in my line of work, being a civil rights lawyer and seeing the struggles of African Americans over a long period of time, to have this happen in a relatively short period of time is an amazing story. And I think one of the legacies that we have to hold, we have to continue, is we have to tell our story, tell the Japanese American story. I think people have done a good job at doing that, and I think it needs to continue. And we also see the need for this, as we saw in those days after 9/11, when there was serious talk of locking those people up. And I was quite proud of the response from the Japanese American community, who would have been easy to say, they brought down the Twin Towers, they crashed the plane into the Pentagon. We should lock those people up, whoever they are. And I was proud that people stood up and said, well, wait a minute. We did that. We did that before. We need to learn our lesson. I was proud that Secretary Mineta was there in the White House at the time. And one of my good fortunes over the years was to have grown up in San Jose. And Norm Mineta was my mayor. He was a family friend, and everybody knew Norm. But Norman's been always there providing advice and counsel to me over the years, and that really has served me well. It's been a stroke of luck, not genius, but luck, that I've been able to use over the years. But Norm was there in the White House telling the president that we did this before, we made a mistake, and by this point in time universally acknowledged that this was a mistake and it can't happen again. But you have to tell the story. You have to be out there constantly reminding people. You have to, I think, one of the lessons that I learned from redress was that it isn't, it just couldn't have been our community, the Japanese American community, the limited numbers of us, however we may be constituted, who live here now. But you have to create a broader coalition. And you folks know this living in Minnesota, right? How many folks live here? Of Japanese ancestry, Asian descent, not that many, I would think. But from where I sit in Washington, on a political level, you really need to come and work together with people who may not have shared the same experiences, but are in the same boat. And I've seen the progress that we've made with Asian Americans generally. And, frankly, these are disparate communities. People who may not have ties together on so many levels. But as a political community, have come together in more and more ways over the years. And it's my view that that's the way you can make some progress. That's the way you can work together to make it happen. Because our community standing alone can't do it. And I think that, for the Japanese American community, was really one of the lessons we learned and we used during the fight for redress back in the